So here's a review of what is the proper expectations of, what is legible by RFID readers and what is not legible by RFID readers. Whether it's a fixed RFID reader on the ceilings or a handheld RFID reader, what is the proper expectation? Can we read hundreds of RFID labels on widget A, on liquids, on metals? In what environments can it read? Can it not read? And what is the difference between handheld performance versus hands-free RFID performance, the fixed ones on the ceilings? What is the performance difference between smaller RFID labels versus larger RFID labels, and the materials and the environment? So in this document, I've tried to have different examples and give you guys that information based on how RFID works, and this is based on my experience for the last many years that I've been in RFID. So essentially, in the first example, if you have a box of most goods, as long as directly behind the cardboard it's not metal or liquid, and that label, which is like the sticker RFID labels that I talked about in the earlier videos, the lower cost labels, if you're applying those to a cardboard box, typically those will have a very, very easy legibility by a handheld RFID reader or a ceiling RFID reader, or again, the fixed readers could be on a column, it could be human level, so it just depends. You could install them anywhere, but no matter what, these sensors can read them pretty easily. It's one label, one box, and it goes through an exit. It will read it very, very easily. Typically, if it's going through getting loaded into a container, it will read it very easily. Typically, if it's going from zone 1 to zone 2, for example, sales floor to backstock, warehouse 1, warehouse 2, it will get picked up by sensors, whether it's handheld or fixed, very easily. As long as don't forget, RFID does not penetrate through liquids. So if somebody purposely, obviously, puts their hands on an RFID label perfectly, they could block it from getting read, but that's typically not the case. So as a part of RFID technology, any technology can be circumvented. Whether it's EAS in the stores, you could put foil around those and circumvent them. If somebody knows the technology is there and they have the know-how to circumvent it, they can circumvent anything. But again, this is all under the premise that it will work typically if somebody's not deliberately trying to circumvent the technology or knows how to circumvent the technology. But continuing further on, the RFID labels on the boxes can typically be read easily, as this explains. An RFID label that is good quality, the size is typically 3.8 inches by 1 inch, and that could be read from 20 to 40 feet distance from a ceiling reader. So for example, that's the other thing to take into consideration is when you're planning out your installation, where do you want your fixed readers? You can't have them up 50 feet up in the air. If your ceiling is 50 foot high, you're going to have to lower them using threaded rod, for example. And you guys saw some pictures of installations on high ceilings, or you put them on the columns at lower altitudes. The sweet spot is typically 12 to 15 feet high, but the labels in a free air test can be read from 20 to 40 feet away when you do a straight test in a perfect lab environment. But from a handheld reader, handheld readers can typically read less than fixed readers because, don't forget, they have batteries, they have power management, so they cannot necessarily read as strong as a fixed reader. So they would typically read a label on a box from 15 to 25 feet distance from a handheld reader. Labels that are as small as 2 inches by 1.5 inches can be read still from 10 to 25 feet distance. And may still be legible from ceiling mounted readers. So again, the reason why we're giving you all of this information is so that you can decide and understand if your electing to use a handheld RFID solution or a hybrid or a seal, or if you're thinking of a hands-free RFID solution throughout the entire space, what is the expectation and what is legible and what is not legible from a ceiling reader? The handheld is the easiest. You walk up to things, whether it's 1 tag or 50 tags or 100 tags, you're getting right up against it. It's easy, it's convenient. Yes, there is manual labor involved. It's not 100% hands-free, but it overcomes a lot of the distance and challenges, distance challenges, and possible challenges of having metals, shelves, and those kind of things that could block getting reads from a ceiling reader. So this was one example, 1 box, 1 label. It's typical, it's easy. In the next example, we have 50 goods inside of the box with RFID labels on each of the goods inside the box. So as it explains, depending on the RFID label size and quality, a ceiling mounted reader may read 30 to 50% of the items inside of the box and less if it's passing fast by the fixed reader. So you need to have the right understanding. If you have a box of 50 items, yes, the RFID sensors are reading hundreds of things per second, but they will most likely not read everything inside of a box as it passes through quickly and the fixed readers on top of the ceiling. If the reader is 2 feet from the box, it could have a better chance of reading everything, but not from 15, 20, 30 feet. So understand that. Don't expect that it's going to read all of those. Typically, if the box moves, we do also have a mechanism where we could have 1 label on the box and we link the box or the children tags inside the box to the master tag. So when the box moves, you could assume that the children labels moved with it. So there are techniques to assist with that. But as far as the RFID sensors goes on the ceiling, have the correct expectation. A ceiling reader will not read a box with 50 things moving all in one shot. It will read a certain percentage of those things, and it will reflect a certain percentage of those on the software dashboard as far as the movement goes. The next example is what if you have a pallet with 500 goods inside of the cumulative of all the boxes? Will one reader pick up that all of these things went through? No. The answer is no. One reader will not. A handheld scan will. Basically, a handheld scanner, somebody would walk around the pallet and without opening the boxes, they could read through all the boxes. If it's apparel or accessories or most things, as long as it's not metal, liquids, or carbon fiber plastic, and as long as the signal can penetrate through the boxes, it can read through, and it could read all 500 with a handheld, easy. With a 1 fixed reader above, not so easy. Again, it will pick up some, but it won't be able to penetrate through all of them, and it won't be able to read from all sides as you can with a handheld to read them properly. That's why if you do have the desire to read 500 things in a pallet, that's why they do RFID tunnels. An RFID tunnel is when they have RFID readers, 2 on top, 2 on the left, 2 on the right, so that when it goes through, you're hitting it from all sides, you're maximizing the performance and the RF so that it can do what the handheld does from all around with the fixed readers. And depending on how challenging it is, sometimes we have customers that may even put these on a turntable in the RFID tunnel, and it turns to even make it better and faster. So it turns for like 5 seconds, it reads everything, and then they take it off and it goes through. So there are many different ways of reading assets. You have to test and see what works for you, what doesn't work for you. We do have situations where if it goes through and it doesn't pick up, for example, 10% of them, you'll get an alert, and then you could use a handheld to read the missing stuff. So you could supplement with a handheld as well. But again, the thing is to have the right understanding of what's legible, what's not legible, and how to calibrate your expectations as to what is going to work and what is not going to work. The next example is a challenging example. In this example, you have cheese, guacamole, these type of things. They have liquid in them. If you're putting the RFID labels in front of these cheeses and they're back to back, well, guess what? The RFID signal is not going to penetrate through the cheese behind it. So if the label is like right there, it's not going to pick up the cheese behind it. So that's a challenging situation. You see how there's space above these. If you have a flag type label where there are these labels where a portion of the labels stick out, you could possibly do those products much easier. But these down here typically would not be a good candidate for RFID reads, whether it's a handheld or fixed. And by the way, you could put fixed in the ceilings. There are credit card size antennas that you could put in the shelves to read. But again, the labels would have to be on the top of the product, not in the middle or below, because RFID, liquid metal, it's not going to penetrate. So don't forget that. If you have situations like this where you're putting products on a shelf and you have 4 boxes back to back and on top of each other, when you're doing your RFID handheld scan or a fixed scan, you'll read the ones on the front, but the ones behind them, if they're penetratable by RFID, for example, again, apparel, accessories, most things that allow RFID penetration, you're okay. You could read all of them. But if you've got electronics in there, then it's not gonna, for example, penetrate through a iPad and read the tag that's sandwiched behind it between 2 iPads. So typically what you would do is you would put the labels on the top of the iPads, and even then, if you've got iPads on top of it again, it's not going to penetrate through. The benefit of having fixed sensors in that sense is if you have fixed sensors in the shelves, when you put it in, it can most likely capture that it went in there, and then you'll get a last seen location that it went into the shelf, and then it will stop pinging and it will read the one that's now above it, but you still get the last place that it was seen on the map, and that's okay. This example is talking about how RFID labels may not be read all the time. So having the correct expectation. If you've got a pallet with a label on it and you've got a fixed sensor above it, you're going to read that tag all the time because there's nothing blocking it. But if you've got another pallet on top of it and you have a pallet in front of it, this pallet A will no longer be seen. So let's say in this example, it's saying, pallet A was last seen on this date at this time, and then they put pallet B on top of it, and then it stopped reading it, and it also got sandwiched in the front and the top. So it's not penetrating, but that's okay. This demonstrates that not all RFID labels need to be read all the time, but it's acceptable since the last seen location again is visible on the map. As soon as these guys move away, this thing will get picked up again, and it will start moving to another area of the facility. It will get picked up and it will move. So it's acceptable that things are not seen all the time by the fixed RFID readers. So if you're signing up for a fixed RFID system, you should recognize that not always, depending on how things are stored and on the environment, may things be read all the time. If you have jewelry, for example, and those are very expensive items, you could put RFID sensors within the shelves, in the counters, facing up, and you have the RFID labels. And you could set a rule in the software that says if a ring is removed from the showcase for more than 5 minutes and it is not returned, then set off an alert. That's okay. That will work. That's because the label is right there next to the antenna. There's nothing blocking it, and it's expected that it will come back. But different environments, different use cases, you have to realize that many times it is okay that things are not read all the time. But then you say, okay, then how do I know something is stolen? Well, this is why, like we mentioned at the beginning, it's very important that you also have the RFID sensors at the exit points so that you can know when things go out, or at least as much as possible, if it's not being circumvented somehow. And don't forget, these sensors can be next to the doors, above the doors. So, to most, situations, these things will notify you if something leaves the premises. And so you will get notifications in that fashion. Going back to more examples, a store, with 20,000 products, they've got fixed antennas in all of these places. It says, typically retail stores, which look similar, can be inventoried using handheld RFID or by fixed RFID ceilings. Fixed RFID readers need to be installed every 7 to 10 feet to capture the items in all the areas. So why every 7 to 10 feet? The reason is because of the reads of the antennas. So the antennas read at different heights 59 degrees. So the higher the antennas go, the bigger the area they can read. So in that picture that we were looking at, obviously at that height you would have to have more to read those areas. At the same time, if you put them higher, their performance drops, because don't forget, these labels are passive RFID labels and they require the RF signal to get energized to talk back. So if you go further away from them, for example 20 feet, 50 feet, they won't have enough energy to talk back and you won't read. So if you have 1,000 items, you may read only 30 or 40% of them on a 30-foot ceiling if you have the antennas that high. But if you have them at 12 or 15 feet, you'll read 95%, for example, if you're using the proper RFID label. So it's a trade-off. But again, we're going based on experience of what works and what doesn't work, typically every 7 to 10 feet, depending on the density, the environment, and the antenna height. And it talks about, the labels should be at least 2 inches by 1.5 inches. You don't want to use a 1 inch by 1 inch label. Those do not typically qualify for a ceiling mounted installation. If you're going to have smaller labels, you're going to have to get those antennas embedded into your shelves if you're thinking about fixed RFID. But if you've got handheld, then no problem. You just walk up to it and scan it in. So again, easier to do handheld in that sense, where there's less installation involvement and thinking of how do I install this? Is my tag too big enough? Is it not big enough? Is there a blind spot? Is there not a blind spot? So there are things to take into consideration. A typical person in such a location with 20,000 products can inventory everything in 30 minutes to an hour if everything goes as planned. A fixed RFID sensor can do that in half the time. Typically, you can push a button, reset it, and read everything and compare your inventory with your ERP or POS system. If some RFID labels are blocked by metal objects, they may not be read from ceiling readers. Thus, a handheld RFID scanner is most always recommended to read possible hard-to-read areas. Yes, absolutely. So we always recommend customers to start with a handheld and then do the choke points fixed. If you're set on a fixed RFID system, we still always recommend a handheld, because there are always situations where you may have a blind spot. So for example, this guy is reading these clothes right here, but imagine if the last shirt on the wall, if the label is, the signal is bouncing off of that metal bar and it's not getting to that tag, so it's not reading back. So you would have situations like that where a handheld could really assist you to closing that gap. Even a 3 to 5% could be hundreds of items when you have 20,000 items. Going to other types of merchandise, sunglasses, smaller labels, they don't qualify for ceiling readers. Typically, you're going to want to read those with a handheld scanner, or you're going to have to embed antennas at closer proximity to those displays if you're expecting hands-free. Metal, again, is not friendly for RFID. If you've got product up against the metal grid, the stuff in the front will read fine, but the item on the back, if that label happens to be right where the bar is, that metal can detune the tag and not allow the signal to bounce back, and you'll have problems with metal grids of the items closer to the grid. If you space it out a little bit, you'll be fine, but if it's touching the metal and it just happens that the label is right where the metal is, then you're going to get some read issues there. In this example, they've got a merchandising shelf. One antenna won't be able to read this stuff on this side because the metal grid is blocking, absorbing, bouncing the signal, and it's not reaching the product. So you're most likely, if you're going to use metal, which we suggest you don't if you can, if you want to make your location RFID friendly for fixed readers, you have more legwork to make sure your fixtures and everything is as much as possible not metal and not carbon fiber plastic. So in this situation, you're going to have 2 readers to read the products on this display. In this example, again, with a handheld reader, you could easily get into those shelves and read those pants, but with a fixed reader, most likely you can read most of the stuff on the top as long as they're not getting blocked by the shelf. So if the labels are further back on those pants and the shelf metals are blocking the signal from reaching, you won't read those, especially the bottom shelf. You're going to have a challenge from a fixed reader on the ceiling. You got to get the antennas into the shelves. So again, a 100% fixed system is more difficult if you take environmental shelves into consideration and these kind of things into consideration. Now it's talking about liquids. Liquids can be read from fixed readers, from handheld readers. Typically, RFID labels that are applied to liquids or metals will have a less of a read distance range. So if a fantastic RFID label 3.8 inches, 4 inches by 1 inches can typically be read from 35, 40, 45 feet away, when you come to the specialty labels for liquids and metals, automatically the distance is always less. Even with the specialty more expensive tags, it's usually half of those other ones. Why? Because metals and liquids, they either absorb or bounce the signals, and it makes it harder for the RFID signal to reach the tag and also to read back. So performance drops. So it basically explains, standard lower cost RFID labels cannot be applied to liquids or liquids at all, because even the tag that reads from 40 feet away, if you apply it to a bottle, you won't be able to read it maybe from 2-3 inches away. It will be very challenging. Special RFID tags 50 cents and up are typically used for liquids, metals, carbon fiber plastics. And then it explains that it matters how you store these type of products, because the signal does not penetrate through the liquid. You can read these type of assets, liquids, metals, canisters, whatever it is, from top and from this angle as it's showing it on this picture, but not from this angle. If you're thinking that you're going to store these bottles sideways and you're going to be reading it from the back through the liquid, it's not going to read. You have to read it from the other side, or you have to consider putting labels on the bottoms of the bottles if you're thinking that you're going to count those towards the inventory. So this is what it's demonstrating again. This is explaining that they're legible from ceilings. Yeah, it could be legible from a ceiling, but it is more challenging. So again, you have to test and see, from your location, how high can you have your fixed RFID sensors if you're doing a ceiling installation, or if you're putting an in shelf, then it's easier. You just have to have proper enough RFID coverage within your shelves to read the tags on the bottles. Sometimes you could have security heads on the bottles for wines, for example, and you could put the label on the security head so it's completely away from the liquid, and then you could use the other tags that have better performance as well. So again, it requires testing and fine-tuning to get it to work for you guys the way you want. Typically, this is why professionals go out and do site surveys and testing and educate you in person and tell you what's going to work, what's not going to work. Do you use fixed or do you use handheld? To make it simpler, go with handheld. We recommend. And after you have a handheld solution and you learn to master handheld RFID scanners, 3 months down the line, look at fixed RFID for shelves, choke points, and then if you want to do the whole area, do the whole area. But take into consideration, not everything is eligible for hands-free RFID from ceilings. You may have to get into the shelves, and that's more labor-intensive installation. Not that much, it's a one-time, but still, it's not as simple as just a handheld RFID. This is explaining that if, where do you put the labels on the bottles, liquids, canisters, whatever it is, whether if it was a metal canisters or bottles, if the top of the bottle is narrower, there's space between it, the signal can reach all of them. But if you're putting the labels on a lower altitude on these wine bottles and you're sandwiching these labels between liquid bottles, they're not going to read. You're not going to be able to read 4 bottles. You'll only read the front one. You won't read the ones behind them because it doesn't penetrate through liquids. But if you put the label and you're mindful of the orientation and how the signal needs to reach it, it doesn't have to be line of sight. It can bounce around it and read it, but still, it cannot be sandwiched between liquids or metals or carbon fiber plastic. This is an example of some other product. It's a vial and it has some sort of a liquid in it. And it's using an RFID label that's unique. It's called a flag tag, and it's distance from the body, so it can read it from an RFID hand scanner very easily. But still, if you put all of these together and that label gets sandwiched between 20 of these, you'll have a challenge. So a better idea would be to get a round RFID label and put them on the top of the bottles so that from the top orientation, you could read them very easily and very fast. So again, this is demonstrating, yes, this is an option, but this is a better option. So you need to take these things into consideration. This is talking about iPads. This is what we talked about earlier. If you're putting the labels in front of the face of the iPads and you're storing them in a shelf and you're putting 10 of them back to back and the RFID label again is sandwiched between these electronics, it's not going to read. So what is the proper place? Put the RFID labels on the edge, either the top edge, or you could even put on the top and the bottom. So you can have more than one label on each asset, especially if it's a high value asset. Put 2, put 3, put 4. You can have multiple labels with the same EPC number, RFID number, so that no matter which way it's oriented, when you read it with the RFID hand scanner or fixed sensor, you can pick it up. So there are ways to address these challenges with more RFID labels to better your performance for in these kind of situations.